Now that you're done decorating your stuffed animal, we're going to go ahead and punch the holes. It's good to make sure that you have a couple of staples in your animal so that the two pieces don't shift while you're punching holes, or some of the holes could be mismatched. If you don't have a stapler, you can glue a couple of different spots on your animal and then start punching. Right here, I'm using a hole puncher, but if you're doing this at home, you could get a pen, and then on a soft surface like carpet, you can lay your stuffed animal down and poke little holes using a pen. I'm going to make sure that I poke holes all around my animal. I'm going to get some yarn, and I want to get enough yarn to go around my whole fish. So I'm going to try and get like a piece that's almost about as tall as I am, and I'll go ahead and cut that piece of yarn. Here I'm using a plastic needle to sew with, but if you're at home, you could get a piece of tape and wrap it around the end of your yarn to make it a little bit more pointy, or even some long shoestrings would work to sew your animal. Maybe you'd need like about a couple. But I'm going to go ahead and thread my plastic needle with the yarn, and then just like I tie my shoes, I'm going to create a loop and put one of the tail ends through that loop, and I'm going to go ahead and tie my needle onto my thread or my yarn. Now I'm going to take the other end of my yarn and I'm going to tie this onto my stuffed animal wherever I want to start to sew. So I'm going to push the yarn through one of the holes. I'm going to pull it out, and then again I'm going to make a loop, put the smaller end of the tail into the loop and pull and repeat, so that I have a double knot, so that I know that my knot is going to stay on my stuffed animal. Now that I've got my knot, I can begin to sew. I'm going to go ahead and choose the direction that I'm going to sew in. So I'm going to sew around this way. And so I'm going to go underneath my fish and come out on the top of my fish. And I'm going to pull the thread all the way through till I hit the knot. And then I'm going to go into the front and out in the back of my fish. And I'm going to again pull the thread through until it creates a flat line on the surface, and then I'm going to go into the next hole underneath the fish and over, and pull that yarn all the way through. Now I'm going to go over the fish, pull the yarn through, and my needle's now under my fish, and I'm going to repeat this process going over and under, over and under. Okay, right now I'm almost to the point where I started sewing, so it's time to stuff. So I'm going to take some scrap pieces of paper, just paper that was left over from when I cut out my fish, and I'm going to crumble it up. This usually works better when you have smaller pieces of paper and you just want to kind of crumble them up. You can open them up and crumble them again. You could tear the pieces of paper into smaller pieces. But I'm going to go ahead and get those papers crumbled up so that I can stuff my fish with them. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pick up my fish and find that opening, and then I'm just going to start to push these papers into the inside of my fish. I forgot to mention earlier that before you start stuffing, if you had some staples in the middle of the fish's body, that could prevent you from stuffing the fish's body. So I can take those staples out or have an adult help me with that. If I glued, I could maybe gently stick my hand in there and see if I can separate the two pieces without tearing. But right now, I'm just going to go ahead and get that paper into my fish. until it's stuffed as much as I want it to be stuffed. All right, so I put the last of the stuffing in, so now I'm going to find um, my the end of my yarn again, and I'm going to pick up my sewing, and I'm going to go ahead and sew my stuffed toy until I reach that first stitch that I made where I tied the yarn onto my fish. Now that I'm back where I started, I'm going to go ahead and take the end of the yarn, the tail end from where I first started sewing, and I'm going to sew that to the tail end of the back of my yarn, the yarn that's left over after I have sewn around my stuffed animal, and I'm going to go ahead and tie a double knot. Because we're working with paper and string, there's a chance that parts of your stuffed toy might tear, so you could use tape, a stapler, or you could glue your stuffed toy if there's any parts that are kind of open and letting the stuffing come out. These don't have to be perfect. Here are just some examples of stuffed toys that students made in the classroom. Students made sure that they decorated the front and the back of their stuffed toys. They added a lot of details to their stuffed toys on both the front and the back. Students were inspired by many different animals like bears or cats. We had a lot of students make pets like cats and dogs. And just notice how these are very beautiful. They're very detailed. Students put a lot of work into them and they really do love them. What will you make?